really tried to make a drama out of this. And my HDMI adapter didn't work anymore, and so I already was looking for a flip chart. Okay, so but the room is full, and that means either people are interested in starting with Docker for development, or they made some rough experiences in doing so. So who already did work or try to work with Docker in development? And I knew it. So, okay. What you can expect from this talk, because you now still have the chance to leave, okay? Or anytime. I don't take it personal. So I'll tell you about the experiences I made during the last couple of years using Docker in development, but also in production. The problems I faced, things like slow file synchronization and all kinds of other things. I'll show you some different possible solutions for that. And then in the end, I'll show you a little, I'd say, tool set or development environment we currently use for working with our content management system. And that is unfortunately not the tool you can use for anything else, but you're absolutely invited to look into the scripts we have. I also put them into the slides so that the solutions we found for our specific problems or for more general problems, that you can at least adapt them for your own projects. Or maybe at the end you decide to not go for Docker at all. So that could also be the case. Yeah, so my name is Robert. My background is basically I'm working in, it's a hobby, but I do that full time in an open source project doing a content management system that is called Neos. And like to earn some money, I try to consult people and help them with that, and also with Kubernetes and Docker. So. Docker. Is anyone using any other container solution than Docker, or has been using, like LXC or Vagrant? Yes. Well, okay, let's talk about Vagrant then, because I mean, you probably started with just native development environment on your computer, and then virtual machines came up, and then something like Vagrant came up. But just to make the case, like, where is really the line between something like Docker, container technology, and something like Vagrant? It's really important to remember that Docker is not some kind of virtual machine. So it's really just a clever way to isolate processes on your computer, and that means usually it's very fast. So, but as most of you have worked with Docker, I'm not telling you anything new. So before I show you the problems and solutions, you need to know what were my goals for a development environment, and I'd really love to know what your goals were. So I'll ask you, maybe you already make up your mind. So when I have a development environment, I don't want to take compromises on the tooling set I can use. So, for example, if I have something and I cannot use my favorite IDE, or I have to like set up some weird intermediate scripts to do so, or I cannot use something like Xdebug or some other profiling or whatever. I really just want to work as if I'm working natively. And of course, I also don't want to lose any code or so. So I don't want to program in some container which disappears and then all my code is gone and so on. That was one of my goals. Then it should be fast, because if usually in a development context my application would respond like in 400 milliseconds or so, that's completely fine for me during development. But if it takes 5 seconds for a request, that makes me angry. And also very inefficient, because like with any website visitor, you start thinking about something completely different and then finally drift off. So that's not acceptable for a development environment. I think that it makes everything really slow. And I don't know, who's working with lots of different projects, like web agencies and so on? Like, do you have new projects all the time? Okay, like a third maybe. And so I guess the rest of you is mostly working on one application or one solution in your company. So for me, it's the case that I have lots of different projects with, which have a different age also, like different PHP versions based on sometimes some old inactive project could become active again, but only for a day. So I really wanted to be able to switch very easily between these projects and also to start a new project. When I want to try out something, or for example, I want to give a demo with Neos, the CMS, I want to be able to just start a new thing very easily and not spend like 15 minutes in doing so. And then probably what hopefully is like your main motivation to use something like Docker is you want to try to match the development software with what you have in production. So sorry for asking you all the time, but it's really, I really want to know. So when you use Docker for development, who also uses exactly the same images in production? That is very few. And that is usually the case because it's not so easy to do. First of all, it's an organizational problem because developers are usually caring for their development environment and some other administrators are caring for the production environment. So there's not like you as a developer have a lot of say into how the production images will look like, and that's the problem often. All right, and then I always have some additional software. And that is actually not really a big problem, but it's actually one of the beauties, I think, of Docker, that I don't have to really install Elasticsearch or any other solution. I can just spin up a Docker container for trying it, and it doesn't really, sometimes it doesn't really have to be something like in production. It's good enough to have some Elasticsearch or some Solr or whatever running. And that should be easy to do, so it shouldn't be like a rigid concept for my development environment. What do you do with Composer? You know, do you use the PHP on your machine for running Composer update? And the problem with that is it will use the dependencies of your PHP and put that into the Composer log file. So for example, if your Mac, for example, is running PHP 7.2, but in production you have 7.1, and you do a Composer update and check in the Composer log file, you might have incompatible code there. And that happened all the time. So okay, before we look at the problems and solutions, let's see what could you actually do without Docker. Because honestly, as much as I like all this container stuff, sometimes I wonder why are we using it for this and that just because it's so fancy. There's another talk by Sebastian called An Ode to Boring Technology. And No, by some other Sebastian. No, and I can only second that. Don't forget about the boring technology. It really makes sense sometimes, yeah. And so there are easy solutions. Of course, it's not a problem to install multiple PHP versions. That is not really a problem. It has been like, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. And you can come up with clever ways like different ports for PHP, FPM, and so on. But the problem, of course, is if you really want to match production, then you also need the correct web server. So I've seen lots of projects where for development they were using Nginx, and then in production they're using Apache. And Well, surprise, there were some differences. And about the quick setup of new projects, I mean, you want to type in some, I don't know, like a subdomain of localhost or subdomain of test or whatever into your browser so you can reach your different projects. And there are some clever ways to do so. So you could set up a little DNS server like DNS mask on your computer, which uses virtual hosts based on directory names and things like that. And I guess, yeah, so there are lots of ways to do that. And if it's not so important to match what you have in production, then this might still be a way because it's way less complex. So I asked you basically what you did, but what kind of Docker setup are you using yet currently? So are you, first of all, where is the code you're working with? So when you have your IDE and press save, where does it save to? Your local disk of your computer or inside the container? So who's working on the local disk and mounts that somewhere? So, okay, about the half. So the alternative is you could, for example, in PHP Storm, say every time I press save, it will upload the file through SSH or some other way directly into the container, and then the master is there. But that also means that any Git operation or Composer operation must be done in the container. And well, when you remove that container or volume, then it's gone. So let's see. Docker Compose is probably the only real solution to work with this Docker setup locally. And what you could do is, and usually you will have something like a web server, PHP FPM, and a database, plus what you need in your project, right? So let's see how the setup looks like. It depends, of course, what's necessary for your specific setup. So probably you need to create a Docker Compose YAML and then add the specific versions to it and so on. So I'll show you quickly. Now we are facing a few problems. I'll show you basically in theory what the solution is, and later on practically how it really looks like. So if it's not so much detail, don't be worried. There will be more details, right? So what you can do is create templates for that. So you say, I create a new Neos project. I have a Docker Compose YAML template for these kinds of projects. And when you have that standardized Composer YAML, you use scripts to initialize a whole new project. So you go into your project directory and type something like my dev environment init, and it will create these files. And maybe some other files as well, maybe some database settings into settings YAML, things like that. So just create a little script which you're using for initializing your projects and even upgrading your projects. I'll show you how in a Docker Compose YAML you can take advantage of default values and environment variables. That's very important because if you have a template, you don't want to change the file actually, because what is if the template improves, then you have, you can't really upgrade your Docker Compose YAML. And environment variables are specifically important because that is a concept you can use in development but also in production. So if you design your application that it can handle environment variables, for example, for database credentials, for certain settings and so on, you don't have to change your code at all, and you can use exactly the same Docker images, but use different values for your environment variables locally. Docker Compose natively supports .env files, so that means if, for example, in your project directory you have a file called .env and there are environment variables defined. They are available in your Docker Compose YAML. You can even do a little cascade of that, but that needs additional scripting, and I'll show you that as well. Another problem is port management. So you want to access your project, for example, in a browser, but also maybe through some other ports. And if you have multiple projects running, then you could go for random ports, but you always have to look them up. And every time you start your project again, you have to look them up again. Or you define, you have a certain scheme or a list or an Excel sheet or whatnot, which says on my computer, port 8237 is specifically for that project. And you put it into your Docker Compose YAML. But it's really cumbersome. And especially you cannot share that with other developers, because what kind of projects do they have on their machine, and then they have conflicting ports. So what you really want to do is try to automate that with something like service discovery on your machine, so that this happens automatically. I'll show you how to do that. So who is completely happy with how speed is, for example, on a Mac or Windows with using Docker for development? Who's happy with that? Me! Okay, so it really depends on your project, but unfortunately that is, unless you're using Linux, because there everything is natively, it's very, very slow. And I really tried to memorize what I'm going to tell you now, but I had to write it down because it's so complex. I want to tell you what happens actually when a file changes and finally it ends up in the container. Okay? So because you know that, for example, on a Mac, Docker is not running natively as a Mac application, so there's a little virtual machine using HyperKit. So somehow you have to synchronize the file from a directory into the container, and that goes through the virtual machine, then through some driver for the OS X virtual file system. And then what happens is it's transfused. Okay, so the file is turned into a fuse message into the Linux virtual file system. Then it's proxied over a virt.io socket by transfused. That is another software running there. Then it's forwarded onto a Unix domain socket by HyperKit. Then it's deserialized, dispatched, and executed as a macOS system call by OS X FS. And that was just like the first 10% of what's happening. So every time you change a file, all that happens, and it takes about 100 microseconds per file. Now, you would say, yeah, but during development I don't have so many write processes, right? The problem is that in order to guarantee the consistency between the file system in the container and your host system, read access is also very expensive and takes a long time. And that is why if you have a lot of read access in your application, and for example in Neos we have a whole directory with generated proxy files, code, actually compiled code if you want, and compiled templates and things like that. And that all has to be read. And it doesn't really, even opcache won't help you with that, because there will be a read access asking, did that file change? And that takes quite some time already. So that is why it's so slow. So what can you do? As I said, you could decide to not mount your local directory into the container, but work within the container. I wouldn't do that. I tried that for some time and lost quite some code. And as I said, when the container is, if you do a Docker Compose down and decide to delete the volume as well, then everything is gone. That's way too risky. So what you could do is they improved the file synchronization a lot recently, like, I don't know, a year ago or so, for Docker for Mac, and introduced new caching options. I think I even have a diagram next. So there are different options you can set for volume mounts, which are called consistent, which is the default, cached, and delegated. And the difference between them is the guarantee and how fast some changes are ending up in the container or on the host. So usually when you develop something, you want that the host is responsible or is authoritative, and every change ends up in the container. You don't want that the container wins in doubt, right? So it might take like a few milliseconds until everything is consistent in the container, and that's just fine. So theoretically, something like delegated should be completely fine for our case. This is an example of this Symfony demo app running with a consistent cache backend, uncached backend, then cached, but without any cache entry, and then the warmed up cache. And all you need to know is, okay, it's faster. Yeah, so that's what these diagrams are for. Sometimes you want to have consistent, so especially if when you're using Docker in production, you definitely want that, for example, an invoice generated in the container, that it's really written to the data volume. You really want that. With cached, it's a bit faster. So writes performed by the container are immediately available in the host. But that is usually not so interesting in development. And delegated is the fastest option. Still, it's not really fast enough for me. So for example, as I said, like 400 milliseconds without Docker, and then about 3 seconds with delegated for my application. That is too slow for me. And I show you a solution later on. So, and yeah, exactly this solution here. Because you could, depending on your application, decide to bind mount certain directories and others synchronize with something like FS event and rsync. That is definitely the best optimization for speed. It sounds a bit weird, and depending on the solution might even have some hiccups, but that's what I made the best experience with it so far. I'll show you a script for that. So problem is SSH access, really? I mean, we're using Docker. Why would you want to have SSH access to your container? Who's running some SSH daemon in a container? Don't be ashamed, it's okay. Unless you do that in production without very good reasons. But for development, that's completely fine, because you're developing on your host machine, but your application is running in the container. And your application might also have some command line options, some commands you can execute there. In Neos, for example, there's a command for importing a website or for clearing a thumbnail cache and so on. I don't really need PHP on my host machine. I don't even have PHP on my host machine. I log into the container during development and run my commands there with exactly the same PHP version which runs on my production machine. So that is important for me. But getting that right is also a bit difficult, because SSH needs to know which keys are allowed to log in. Then you want to have stable host keys for your SSH server. So not every time you run your project again, you don't want to get that warning that someone tries to do a man-in-the-middle attack and the host key changed and things like that. You want that to be stable. And also ports are again a problem. If everything is running on port 22, then it doesn't work with multiple projects. Lots of problems, right? Okay, we're almost through with the problems. So that's kind of a bonus problem. It's a luxury problem. I really want to have an easy way to synchronize with the production data. So for example, when I'm developing a website locally, I want to be able to get the images, the assets of the live website in an easy way. So that, of course, depends a lot on your application. So if I was developing something like Stripe, I don't want to download the production data on my machine and have the credit card numbers for testing. But still, I think it's always worth looking into that topic, that you have a very easy way to get a realistic amount of realistic data for development. Really. Usually when I get into some project as a consultant, the first thing I try to do is getting a realistic amount of data, because they say, yeah, we're developing with this product system and so on, and we have these 10 products for testing. And then, yeah, but in reality, we have about 400,000 products, but that doesn't matter. I mean, the production machines are bigger than your computer, and so. Okay, you see the problem. Really try to develop with realistic amounts of data. And then I talked about that already, the problem with Composer. That one is a bit tricky, and I don't have a ready-made solution for you today, but I can tell you which approach you could take. So, of course, you need to run Composer in the container somehow, that it's using the right PHP version. But please don't put Composer into your Docker image, which later on runs in production. Don't do that. There is a clever way, an architecture pattern you probably know, which is called a sidecar pattern, so that you have another container running in parallel to your existing container, and they can share a volume and so on. So you can perfectly create a Docker image which only contains the Composer file and mount that into your application image, and then have Composer available during development. The tricky part, I mean, I could show you that, that's very easy, but the tricky part is to actually get your SSH key through SSH agent forwarding and so on into the container, because you might have private Composer repositories, and that takes a little bit of fiddling. Okay? So that's so much for the problems. Any other problem I should try to find a solution for you have in mind before I start with some demo?
So just out of curiosity, how many of these problems just exist because we are using Docker in the first place?
I would say almost all of them, but
just
yeah.
To kind of
that
point.
Absolutely, absolutely. So these are problems you stumble over, which is like, it sounds so promising, but then you stumble over these problems. Exactly. That's the point. Still, the question is, and that depends on your case, but you just have to be aware of your problems and the benefits of your current solution before you take a decision. And for me, usually it was like, it's much more important that I have the same software running in development and production than not dealing with these problems. Okay? And everything which can be solved by development is fine, because then it's solved once for all, and it's not a problem anymore. So let me show you something. Yeah, that is what I'm going to show you is our development environment. It's called Local Beach, and if you're curious, you can actually follow that link and look into the instructions how to use it, look into the Docker files and so on. That is a specific thing for NEOS content management projects or flow applications. So, as I said, not a universal solution, but everything I'll show you find there. And also, what I'm going to demo also appears in the slides. So if you download the slides, you'll also see the scripts in there. So don't try to write down the scripts or something. Okay, so first of all, that is a blue screen with a very weird font which you cannot read. Next slide is, no, let's, let me switch.
It's a desert.
Yeah, that's a desert. And by the way, my control key is not working because MacBook Pro keyboard, so I had to remap control. And I mean, just if you wonder sometimes when I type something ugly, that's because my fingers didn't learn that yet.
You usually work with a font size this small?
I didn't hear that.
You know, Adrian Coyle.
Yesterday it was working.
He meant something different by which the method should fit on one screen.
Yes, yes, yes. Tell me more.
I could, but...
why is it not working anymore? The presentation mode had such a nice profile with so big fonts. Oh, geez, that doesn't matter. So you can read that. Okay. There's an idea. Okay, I really thought like I'd do a full live demo just for the fun of it, and also because it's called a drama. We have all the chances to get a real drama here. So what I'm now doing is I have an empty directory and start a completely new NEOS project by doing a composer create project, and it's downloading, fortunately, from cache, all the composer repositories you need for that. And because I did that in a subdirectory, which is very stupid. Okay, so here we have it. Can you read that in the very back, or should I? Yeah, I should. Thanks for your answers.
You wanted answers.
Is that fine for you? Yes? Isn't that nice? So what you have to know about this NEOS project is there are different directories with different purposes. And one is called data. It contains data, not code, right? And another is called packages. That contains the packages. That is the code. So I want to have different strategies for that, for these two directories, because the code should be synchronized into the container, and what's in data, for example, images I upload and so on, could probably be mounted right away because their speed is not so important, the synchronization speed and so on. And I don't want to lose all the images I uploaded when I do a Docker Compose down or something. Okay? So I have these two different strategies. For packages, I want to use my fancy synchronization, and for data, I do a real file mount, volume mount. Now I mentioned that we created a script for that. Let's install that. Let's see if that works. Brew install beach CLI. And that's something, for example, if in your company everyone's using a Mac or something like that, just put your script into some kind of package like in Homebrew or so. And then everyone can just install it with, oh, that looks interesting. Yeah, with, for example, Homebrew. And now let's see, beach, there it goes. So I can now do a beach local init. And I could say, oh no, let's start with another concept. I said I have the problem with the ports. remember if I have 10 projects and 10 web servers, I want to have one domain and not care about the ports, and I want to have service discovery. So what I have for that is one central Docker Compose application running, which runs an Nginx proxy, reverse proxy, and a MySQL database. So I use that for all the projects then, or MariaDB. So I can just start that, local beach, up. And this script now doesn't really do magic. It's just a nicer wrapper around Docker Compose, okay? So it's not so fancy, and you can look into the code, it's not so much. But now it started a reverse proxy. And then what we did is we registered a domain called localbeach.net. And that points, and don't be scared when you type it into a browser, it points to localhost. So if you don't tell us, yeah, you copied all my data to your servers and so on. No, it's actually your server, okay? You can do that with any other domain, and we have wildcard domains, so I know it's a bit small up there, but you could write something like demo.localbeach and it will still be your local host, okay? That was part one. And now I do a beach local init. I say, please also create a database. And that was it. So what it now created was a Docker Compose YAML for this project and one environment variable file. 1.env file. Let's take a look at that. How is it called? Local beach Docker. Docker Compose YAML. So yes, I'll make it bigger. Don't say anything. So, okay. So I told you try to come up with templates. This is basically a template. So I won't change this template or this file for this project, even if I have different needs. Okay? So I try to not touch it, and that is possible because I use a lot of defaults and environment variables for all kinds of things. So you see, first of all, I'm using a common network for all my projects, which is called local beach up there, so that the reverse proxy can communicate with this container, for example. Then you see, for example, the image for the web server. I don't know if you know that syntax, but that's basically bash or shell syntax. So you can use something like here in image, there should basically be what is in beach web server image. And if that is empty, then use what's after the dash, Flownative beach Nginx. Okay? So that means without modification, you can just use this. But if you want to override the image name, you can specify an environment variable. Okay? And that's important that you make that configurable, especially, of course, by the PHP, for the PHP container down there, where you see container image name is beach PHP FPM, and the image version is latest, which you should not do unless you just want to try out something. Always try to pin it directly to a version like 7 to 10 or what we have. And make sure that you synchronize with production, okay? And yeah, and the rest are just virtual environment variables here. You see that for the web server, I'm using a volume mount called with delegated, because their speed is not so important. It's mostly the static files there. I'm fine with that. And I mount my current development directory into a directory called application in the container. Okay? For PHP, I do something really different. Do you see these volume mounts? So, as I said, data could be, for example, uploaded images, and that is stored in data persistent in my NEOS application. I mount that to application data persistent and make it delegated, so that is mounted like right away, and I don't need to synchronize anything. The logs as well, doctrine migration, things like that. But now you see there's something called application on host. And that's a weird trick I use there. So what I actually do is I mount my local development directory into the container, into that directory application on host. And probably, Stefan, now block your ears, don't listen to that, because it's so ugly. And then a startup script in the container will detect that this directory exists and copy everything to /application. So that is kind of when you start the project the first time, everything is copied again. And from then on, we detect any file changes and synchronize between application on host and application using FS event. Okay, so that sounds really stupid to copy a whole project again to a volume, but that is also what you would do, for example, in Kubernetes, because you cannot create an image in Kubernetes, put that as a container into a pod, and not run it. So in Docker Compose, you can do that. You have a data-only image, which only provides the data, but it's not running a process. But that's not possible in Kubernetes. And what you do there, for example, is running an init container, which only is started once your whole application comes up. And that could, for example, copy stuff to a shared volume. Do you have a question about that fancy, weird construct there? Shocked. Everyone's completely shocked. Okay. By the way, now I see here, for example, health check and so on. That's just another recommendation. Docker Compose also allows you to specify resource limits. So, for example, that a container can only have so and so much memory or only run so. Use that. Yes? Because that makes it even more realistic. Try to set the same limits which you also will have in production, because it doesn't really make sense if on your local machine you have 8 GB of RAM, but in production you don't. Okay. So that was the local BH Docker Compose YAML, and then I have a file called local BH dist.env, and that is the environment variables which I'll actually check into to the project, where I could set some project-specific environment variables which I want to share with my whole team. So if a new developer checks out the project, they already have stuff. And if I have very personal, specific things like API test keys or things like that, I would put that into a .env file and let that git ignore that file. Okay? So that's basically my cascade. Okay. Let's see if that actually will work. So now it started. This it's basically a Docker Compose up, which it did. And now it says when files have been synced, you can access this instance at this URL. As I said, when it comes up the first time, it will copy all the files to that volume. You could follow the progress also. Local logs Oops. So, and what you see, what it's doing there, it came up for the first time, and now it also creates an SSH access to that container. So for that, it needs SSH host keys. And these are generated automatically, but they are not located in the container. Oops, no, not event sourced. Demo. Demo is good. So you see there's a directory at the very top, .localbeach. And that is not checked into Git, of course. Oops. And let me open that. Yeah. And there I have two directories, secrets and home. And here, for example, in secrets, you see the SSH host keys the container just created. So I mount this whole local beach directory into the container and then store data which I want to survive the restart of the containers. And why do I have a home directory? There's actually my shell history in there. So I mounted also the home directory of the SSH user in the container to my local directory, so I don't lose my shell history every time I rebuild my containers, because that is really annoying. If I would ever lose my shell history, I'm not a developer anymore. Because I'm mostly, at least in the command line, I'm working with searching in my 40 years shell history. I have everything in there. I don't know how that is about you. So, yeah, this thing worked here. It says warmed up caches and so on. And it should be neos demo local beach net, theoretically. Oh no. What did it say? Should be neos demo. But I think I confused it with a subdirectory. Ah, that's stupid. Let's see. How about typing it right? Yeah, okay. So I wrote neos with a P instead of an O. That doesn't work. So what's up there in the address line is neos demo.localbeach.net. That ends up in the reverse proxy. I started at the very beginning, the Nginx. And for some reason, that Nginx proxy knows which random port my project is using for the web server and uses that as an upstream. And I can show you that later if you like, but there's a little script which watches the Docker events, and every time a Docker container is started, it will look for an environment variable which is called virtual host. Do you see that here? So that is kind of service discovery for my local development environment. Every time a Docker container is started, some event will happen, and you can listen to these events with a script, no problem. And then you can analyze, is there an environment variable called virtual host? Oh yes, then use that and rewrite the Nginx server configuration to listen to that virtual host. And then use the port used for this web server, for example. So that makes it very easy to use that here. And now I also want to show you SSH. Let me go back. So there you have it, because I tried it yesterday. Line 442, no, 24. Okay. Right. So now I'm logged into my container. Have all the files in there. And you can basically work like normal. So you just open PHP Storm or your favorite IDE, just save locally, and it will appear in the container with usually instantly, but maybe up to a second of delay. For example, I could import the nearest demo site now. So it did that. And when I reload here, I now have the nearest demo site. OK. So yeah, it's, as I said, you don't have to really write it down or understand what's up there now, but this is a script running inside the container which watches file system events. It's not so difficult really. So it's just a bash file in this case. And so you just run that. So you create your Docker image a bit differently or have a flag or something so that it works a bit differently in development than in production. And then activate this watcher here. And then, for example, if there's a delete event, then you just delete the file. So you just say, like, if that event is coming in, then I do copy or delete or whatever, just like that. And the actual script used for watching the file events, we found something there on GitHub. Modified that a bit. You can also find that and modify it a bit. It just does the translation. So every time an event happens, your script is called with a certain argument, and that's about it. So it's a bit stupid that, that you have to do that, or we chose to do that. So I think theoretically, Docker should do that right away, that way, or in a fast way, or in a clever way. But after 4 years of developing within Docker, now the first time it really feels like, yes, it's nicer and faster than I did before natively. So before I used this kind of solution, it was only, yeah, I really want to try it with Docker. And also the benefits of having the same versions and so on prevailed, but I was not really happy. I still had my secret native setup there. I don't have that anymore now. Docker in production, I only want to mention that quickly. There are different ways of running stuff in production, and So you could theoretically use Docker Compose to run your images and so on. It really depends on your website, if how business critical that is, how much you want to learn and so on. If you just want to replace a traditional setup on a server with a Docker setup on a specific server, and you maintain that server manually or with Ansible or whatever, then you might even use something like Docker Compose. And if it should be a bit more clever, like if the server dies, it should come up elsewhere and so on, use Kubernetes. And of course, there are all kinds of different solutions, but this is just to make the choice easy for you. All right, so what do you see after this? Do you think that could solve a problem for you, or do you have other problems left, or will someone go back and not use Docker anymore after seeing these problems? What do you think? That was a very big open question. Yes?
It's not about problem. When you talked about SSHing into the containers, I think there's a better concept where you can just use docker exec -it and then /bin/bash, and you can directly run another process.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So the thing was, there's basically a different way, not using SSH, but just going directly into the container. So let me just find the container. I had nice names for it, right? For example, yeah. So I could do something like docker exec, neos demo php, and then run bash there. That's with a dash, I guess. Yeah. So basically the same, right? Well, basically the same. Now I am root. And when I have that deployed on my production server, I am not root. So I have a specific user which has certain environments, variables preset, and so on. Actually, I want to have, and actually in my production server, I will log in through SSH. Because regular users will do that and not Kubernetes administrators who have access to raw containers. So I think it's completely fine to use docker exec when you only use it for development. In my specific case, it's so that we also need to log in into the production containers in order to run a site import or something like that. And therefore, I chose to use SSH here as well, so it matches production again. But you're completely right. You save yourself a lot of hassle if you're not using SSH and just are fine with docker exec. That's true. Yes?
I think it's completely fine to run the production container as root. And I also think it's completely fine to use Linux in development. So you save yourself a lot of problems, and you have a lot of time to work on security, which I think is important. And yeah, if your container isn't secure, you have problems. And run it as root. That's my recommendation, actually.
Yes, and so the thing was to run everything as root in containers. I agree mostly, because your containers should basically only run one process or some helper processes. And so there's nothing else in there usually. So that usually runs as root. So if you have an Nginx there, that runs as root. And no problem with that. Again, in our case, when a user, a site administrator, for example, SSHs into that container, I don't want them to be root, obviously. So I can just have an additional layer. So security is always a matter of layers. It's not like allowing someone to be root will destroy everything, but not allowing them to be root adds an additional layer. And sometimes even filtering an IP address, that's not really like the ultimate security, but it adds adds another layer, which makes it more difficult, right? So yeah, but using Linux for development, the problem for me personally was I needed to focus on my work, and there are so many exciting things in Linux that I stopped working and only dealt with my Linux. Yeah.
I was just wondering if your talk is available as a blog post or something like that.
That's a pretty good idea. Now you motivated me. Yes, I will. Okay, I'll do that. Okay. Yay. Okay, that's so kind of you. So then be sure to note down my Twitter thing here. I will tweet when I wrote that blog post, and I'll tweet immediately where you get these slides. And I thank you very much for attending my session, and have a good day.